So the next question that I want to talk about is the prominent leaders. I think it's important that we think about the leaders in terms of ancestors and living as well. So Yvonne, you want to talk about who you think, or you want to share? You wanted to talk about Chief Leatherlips, so I wanted you to share that in terms of how did you get to know him, and what do you think we can learn from that statue, from that monument?
So in my 20s, I worked for a restaurant and we did catering on the Muirfield campus or area for the golf tournament. And so there were a couple years in a row that it would get rained out. And it was really interesting because everyone's like, oh my gosh, lots to talk about it. And they're like, it's Leatherlips.
So the golf tournament was typically over Memorial Weekend, and it rained a lot. And so they began to make a connection with Chief Leatherlips that he was unhappy with the golf tournament being there. And so they began to blame or say that it was him that was causing the rain. And so when I even went to look at the website, that's mentioned there. That's how that's just become normalized, that's he would have such power that he would be involved with creating a weather situation for the tournament.
And there were a couple of times where my sister and I were catering, and when we would arrive at the house, the sun would come out. And I just had this like, who is Leatherlips and what is this? If this is real, like, why aren't we talking more about this? And then, so that was, I don't know, 25 years ago. And that sparked my interest of like, who is Leatherlips? This isn't sufficient to just have this little folklore, haha, we have to change the weekend of the Memorial Tournament.
I just would like there to be more of a story than the golf tournament and the rain. I think there's so much more to his story and what he did for the community. And I just don't think that we're honoring that. We're not talking about that he was a peacemaker, that he was working together. So with the people that were trying to settle the area. And that would be a story that would be different than what we typically know about. There was conflict, and beyond the conflict, there was warring, and there was, lots of problems. And then the government came in and removed. So here's a different story. And it's right here in our city. So it just seems like it would be important to talk about.
I want to know more. Like I said earlier, I wonder all the time, like, what was it like for him to have this is his land, and to have this acceptance of the transition that was happening in this area.
Yeah. And we know of his history that he was very much a peacemaker in terms of working with the community or the settlers that were around him, and trying to make that work, make the space work. So as a Wyandotte chief, we know that the Wyandotte were removed, but he stayed because he is, as far as we know, buried here in Columbus. So what do you think we can learn from the monument? What can his monument tell us about how to take care of monuments? Do you have any sense of that?
I guess the only thing that's coming to my mind is, does anyone even know where it is? Like, does like, the average person, like even me, when someone said that's where his head is, I was like, what? And even like, who knew this park was there? So it's kind of like, was that a comment earlier of like, what's the point if no one knows about it, or it's not, is it just like a check the box, like we created it and it's there up there? So yeah, I guess that's kind of the way I feel about that.
As we open up the conversation a little bit, sorry, Maddie, do we know who the artist is?
I don't.
If there's a plaque, it might say, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever read a plaque there, which is part of the challenge, right? If this is supposed to be a Native chief, and we are not honoring the artist who created it. Go ahead, Meg.
I just felt like I have a similar story of stumbling upon a native monument. So I live next to NS Woods Metro Park, and we walk there. And like during the pandemic, I used to go there because I had a newborn, and I was like, I have to get out of this house. And so we would walk there, and I had been there a couple times, and then I just happened to like follow my son down a random path that we hadn't been down before. And there's a native monument telling a creation story and a huge like native woman sculpture, and I'm not remembering the details of it, but I think that's so random magical and beautiful that there are these like pieces in Columbus, and we feel drawn to them in this way. And I want it to be more interconnected because there's all these random pieces. We have arts mural, we have like the sun and moon wall that's under the overpass on Cook Road. There's there's so many random things. I feel like even here at Ohio State, like there's some native artifacts in the Ohio Union that I don't know why they're there. I had to Google it. Why does Barbie Tootle care about Native people? I don't know. I hope I find out someday, but I just wish there was more story
Historical,
and like that passing on of information. And like I'm sure all of these things are connected in some way, and I want to know.
So we're very good about telling history from the victors who won the war. And that's what we focus on. Students can tell the dates, they know the names of the wars, the big ones, who won, but we tell it from the victors' perspective. Until we can tell the 100-year era boarding school story, we're not going to know why we look the way we do and why people don't know their stories. People don't know their stories because out of survival. And so anytime someone would tell me, feel comfortable saying, I have some ancestry, I know that I just don't know who I am, but I know that there's some history. This is a story that I know. And I said, that's why you're here, because they kept that story secret. If they didn't, they could have died. And that's the reality of it.
I'll just say from my kind of role now in Columbus, kind of being the native arts person, I've been able to meet a lot of amazing Indigenous identifying artists as in terms of global indigeneity. And a lot of them are gay, and it's pretty cool. A lot of them are non-binary. A lot of them are spirit like led and driven and are open to that. And all the medicines, plant medicines, all music, whatever, like I've been able to find, it feels like finally people who are kind of tuning in the same frequency that's going on here and staying here in Columbus, or maybe people have left to go to the either coast for the art scenes and then said, hell no, and came right back here. So it seems like there's a bit of what I feel is activity from, like I'm saying, the land and the ancestors here, that there's artwork or artifacts that I feel like need to be made, like, Arthur, like your piece, like there's artifacts that I think that are being asked to be created by Indigenous peoples of all lands, because that's honoring what to me Ohio is, which is lands for all people because of the waterways and the histories here. So I think that is it may be kind of weirdly optimistic, but I like to view that even though we are in the land of removal, we can consider the new ancestry for 7 generations to build new artifacts and maybe give better documentation for future generation what to do with them.
What do you think the city of Columbus should know about our experiences with erasure, invisibility, and hypervisibility?
It's difficult entering into spaces at OSU, at Columbus City sponsored events, where there's this acknowledgement that exists. They do acknowledge the land.
Well, land acknowledgements started several years ago, and it was a an opportunity for us to recognize Native peoples, to recognize and honor the land in which we were doing our work. Native scholars, I think in particular, started offering land acknowledgements at conferences, at other kinds of engagements that were on and off institutional campuses. And they're a strong momentum, like a wildfire, caught on that people were doing it or offering them. And then what happened from a critical perspective, then it became problematic. Land acknowledgements became problematic fairly quickly in the fact that we were being asked, the Native community were being asked on campus, could you offer a land acknowledgement? At that time was the protocol. It should have been offered, land acknowledgement should have been offered by a Native person. But then we thought, well, what happens after that? We're acknowledging the land, and then what happens? Not much.
For example, with acknowledgements, keeping in mind who's in the room, is there Indigenous presence in that room, and that acknowledgement is not enough. I mean, I liken it to having an aggressor impact you negatively, physically or emotionally or spiritually, and they come to you later and they say, I acknowledge that I hurt you. Don't we feel better? And the response to that is great. Acknowledge that, but what are the actions in order to prevent those actions from existing again? And so at OSU, for example, I've worked with a lot of people, many who are in this circle, to increase Indigenous presence at OSU. And we've had many, many, many different conversations with many powerful people in leadership that have gone relatively nowhere. And again, it's parallel to this acknowledgement, to saying we acknowledge that there's pain here. We acknowledge that these histories are hurtful and harmful, and we have a place in that. But what's the next step, right? What's beyond that? And I think next steps are beyond the listening, but action from people who are in power to do something about it, to say it's not enough to acknowledge. It is what is more important is to increase spaces of belonging for Indigenous people, but also for the intersections of identities, so that those spaces of belonging can be learning spaces and healing spaces.
With invisibility, we are barely able to recognize that Native people still exist in Ohio without such pushback. Is disheartening in that how can we make progress in creating monuments to this history, to this dialogue about Columbus and all of that, with when there's barely any structures, foundations that we can start from, I guess, if that makes sense.
I think you raised so many good points as you all have about this relationship that we have, knowing that there's lots of tension in our own community, that we are not a cohesive group, that we have intense distrust of other Native people in the community, and it's something that contributes to some of the challenges. But Natasha, as we come to a close, would you share your ideas around what we all hear are the stories that we're reminded of our resilience, our strength, our joy, our survival? What can the city of Columbus learn about our ability to still love each other, still be in community, still live here?
If the city really wanted to bring Indigenous presence, bring Indigenous voices, I think there could be a lot of interesting conversations and maybe just in like thinking about how we interpret the places we visit, the mounds that are here. You know, the city could reach out to those communities, like whose spaces like we all exist and recreate on, and ask them like what could we do to educate our public about like whose lands they're on. And I think, you know, in some of the places that have been referenced already, you know, there's been efforts to do that, but I think so often what I've seen since being in Central Ohio is that a lot of the interpretation is really outdated, and it still like puts us in the past. And um, I think there could be a lot of cool opportunities to really bring tribes and communities who were removed back to Ohio in that way, and like back to Columbus, and have them you know, talk about their spaces in the way that they want to, because, you know, there's not an author on the interpretive plaque or signage, like we don't really know who wrote it. And so I think for me, like hearing some of your experiences, like visiting places in Central Ohio, like I was at Darby Creek Metro Park a couple weeks ago with my partner, and we were just walking around, and we came across like this part of the trail where it's like, if you go to the right, you can go to an Indian mound. And I was like, oh no, like this is, but like we went over, and they had a sign, and you know, the signage was really outdated. But what stuck with me was that like at one point it said like the first peoples, and the first was like scratched out. And I was like, okay, yeah, like this is like totally Ohio. Like this is like, you know, and it's sad to immediately go to that, but that sort of thinking, but like because I grew up here, like I grew up when the Cleveland baseball team had their mascot. So like that was what people know. And I think if the city of Columbus really wanted to be at the forefront of like, you know, encapsulating the urban native and indigenous experience, and also like, you know, yes, we are a removal state, but there have been other efforts you know, to bring back, I know with like Shawnee interpretation, like bring that to the state of Ohio. I think that just would be, you know, something that I haven't seen other states do that don't have like a federally recognized tribe in their, you know, what are the boundaries of that state. So yeah, I think that would be really something that Columbus could, you know, could actively work towards. And I think so often, like these signs or monuments, like you get one chance to educate somebody, and that's it. You know, you may not have that person in your classroom, but if they go and read that sign, like that's what's going to stick with them, you know, and that's what I think is sometimes almost kind of scary about how we have interpretation out in around us. So
Um, so I think it starts with changing the story, telling multiple perspectives, which is what my degrees are in. How do we bring other voices? My PhD looked at urban students, urban graduate students, urban native students, meaning those born and raised in the city or off reservation. Could we bring in that different perspective, and what could we learn from that? And I talked about the importance of understanding when and why students identify in classroom spaces, because we don't always. And how does that affect our learning experience if we don't feel that we're being authentic to who we are? And what happens when we do say who we are? Then we become the instructor, then we become the all-knowing, then we become the historian. It just is, creates all kinds of problems. So I think just being aware that we're still here, sharing stories, this kind of platform is amazing. And that's why I agreed to be a part of it. And I'm still wanting to be in conversation, because I don't consider myself an activist. I consider myself an educator. And I want to be I'm a better listener than I am a storyteller. My daughter's the storyteller. My daughter and her father are storytellers. I'm a listener. So I think I'm a much better listener than I am a storyteller. But if I can be the one to at least start those conversations and raise some awareness, then it's helpful, I think, in beginning to understand and make connections with other people. about their own histories, which is really, really important, that we all understand beyond our shared identity as Buckeyes, as Ohioans, as Americans. What do we know about ourselves to find different ways in which we can connect? I so appreciate that question of what's to come, what is my hope? Because we know, or at least the way I perceive change, is that it is such a slow. My expectations are that it's a very slow process, and I'm going to see some incremental change, but we know that it's more like a pendulum, especially in diversity, equity, inclusion kind of conversation and momentum movements. It's a pendulum, not a circle. So we will sometimes do very well and make progress, and then we'll not make much progress, and then we swing. So in the conversation that I had with the students not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, I was there to share my story, my life experiences. I shared with them that in terms of my story, how sometimes it was very difficult for me to identify as Native. I haven't always identified as Native. When I came to Ohio, I was questioned more than when I was in California. And particularly in college, people would name me. They would say, well, you're Chicana. You have a Mexican last name. You're from California. You're Chicana. And so I said, fine, I'll just identify as that for right now, because I don't have the energy to counter that. And you're just going to tell me otherwise. And so I stopped the battle, stopped fighting, and identified as Latina for a while. And so I was sharing that story with them and shared that after I got my undergrad degree is when I reclaimed who I was. That stirred quite a lot of emotion amongst them. And they began to share their stories about how they're perceived and how they feel that they have to defend or justify who they are or almost authenticate. Can I give you enough of my history so you'll believe me that this is who I am? And so they were grateful that I shared that with them. So I say all that to say hold that space with them, to be that listening entity that I can carry those, if it's like a hug, a symbolic hug, or just offering support to say, I see you and I know that you've been through, I know what it's like to be through that. So my hope for them, for the next generation, the next 7 generations, is that they will continue to identify and break free from the boxes. That's really my hope, as they can critically think about what those boxes represent in terms of the boxes of how you check who you are. Now, having said that, I'm also pretty adamant about it's not our problem to fix. We didn't create the problem. It's not our problem to fix. We're part of the conversation, so education is going to be so important. So just most importantly, which I think I shared with my daughter, is to seek to other voices to listen to. Recognize that we do live in these 2 spaces, this liminal space of shifting between what it means to be Native and what it means to be raised in a Western ideology, and not lose who we are, not lose that DNA, that way in which we know and connect to who we are. If you connect to the music, say it. If you connect to the language, acknowledge that. If you connect to the history, acknowledge it. Because some don't, even within our own families. Some don't connect as much to that. If you feel it, don't ignore that. Just as we come to a close, that we think about in terms of our resilience and our survival, is that we are all Indigenous intellectuals called to give a counter narrative, right? A counter conversation, to have that awareness that we're getting these messages, to have this awareness that we need to tell these stories of what's missing and what should we honor, what should we celebrate. So as we close the circle, and as I mentioned, it's important that we are doing this work for the next generations. I don't think we can have this conversation without honoring next. So let's take a moment. remember her, them. If you feel a connection, don't ignore it, because you're feeling it for a reason. And pursue that, trust that you're here to carry those stories through, because we know that our ancestors are even think about, my father, all that he did to survive. Not that my mother didn't struggle as well, but all that my father did to survive for me to be here today is something that I have to honor. I have to. I can't. If what he could share that was so terribly difficult for him to share, what he did share wasn't just because he wanted to tell the story of pain, because he wanted to share a story of hope and survival. I feel the responsibility to share that, as difficult as it can be, but share it in such a way that what can we learn from it? So that's what I hope that the next generation will understand and seek, to continue telling stories, continue identifying in whenever way and not be ashamed. But also then I don't want them to live in fear either.